everyone, and welcome to the Center for Human Rights, Equity and Inclusion's annual Inclusion Week. And I'm excited to have people in person this year. This is the first of our in-person events since the start of the pandemic, which I've reminded will be 3 years on Saturday. And in keeping with the changes that the pandemic has brought to us, this event is also hybrid, so I welcome those online and in person. I would like to invite a member of the CHREI team, Dalia Alvara, to provide the land acknowledgement and a short reflection.
Good morning. As this meeting is hybrid and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University stands, and that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. When I reflect on this land acknowledgement, I think of what land acknowledgements aim to accomplish. This includes honoring Indigenous communities, disrupting colonial practices, spreading truth, and setting the stage for true reconciliation. They act as continuous reminders of the shared responsibility that settlers have to Indigenous peoples and the land that they occupy. As many of us are settlers, acknowledging the land is one way we can show our solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Being in solidarity can only be accomplished when we are aware of how our privilege impacts those we claim to stand with, and then building on that awareness to take action and make an impact. This is especially important to keep in mind when considering the work happening at post-secondary institutions across Canada, and the challenge of developing DEDI policies and strategies that are relevant and effective, specifically in colonial institutions. We must consider all forms that solidarity and social justice can and must take. Today's panel, what does social justice have to do with it, and what will, I'm sure, be a valuable conversation about the relationship between DEDI and social justice, will, in a way, make that link. What does it mean to really think about decolonizing and center it when we attempt our DEDI work? Thank you, Miigwech.
Thanks so much, Dalia. As we prepared for this event, we observed a dearth of scholarship on how the DEDI or EDI came to be in the Canadian context. There are many possible threads of the story, which find a trace to employment and the term equity, and that's in the legal context or in a legal framework. And then in other cases, there's scholarship around diversity and the Canadian labor immigration policies of 2000s. But we also wanted to talk about the growing, and whether there would be a growing body of scholarship around how DEDI came to be in the post-secondary environment. We know how, and there is scholarship, some scholarship about how it is today, and that's obviously growing and evolving, but wanting to look towards our roots and what could we, and so the CHREI team gave thought to that, and it's with that thought in mind that this panel was created. How could we contribute to that body of knowledge, to that scholarship, such that we would be a meaningful contributor? This approach is something we drew from this critical approach we learned from one of our panelists, Susan Dion. And it serves as an inspiration for how we structured this fireside chat. Susan wrote about braided learning in her latest book, and something I hope she'll talk about later. And in her book, Susan notes that the storyteller takes what he tells from experiences, his own or as reported by others, and he in turn makes it the experience of those who are listening to his tale. So we went back to the drawing board to decide on the panel and what it could be, and decided that treating it as an opportunity to contribute to the knowledge creation, specifically in the story of how social justice and DEDI might be connected or at times divergent, through the lens of people's experiences in the field, particularly in post-secondary education, might be a productive way of approaching this panel. By gathering here and listening to each other's stories, we hope you get inspired to also take stock of your own story and your own reflection, because even if we might not all center our work within the field of DEDI, nor identify closely with the social justice movement, each one of us together as the collective York community will have an impact on whether the DEDI initiatives succeed or fail. We organized this panel as a fireside chat. We hope to create the kind of intimacy and engagement that we think that the DEDI work needs. It was intentional, and we were moving away from modes of delivery of a speaker imparting their knowledge with less opportunity to engage with us, the participants. As a way of ensuring that our panel and this event is as accessible as we could make it, there is available French language interpreting for those who can join online. There's ASL interpreting both here in the room and online, as well as this transcript in English, and you can see that on the screen here in the room and also online for those who need closed captioning. There will be time for questions. For those who are in person, you'll see that there are QR codes scattered around the room. Use your camera and you can connect to our question forum and submit a question. For those online, you can use the Q&A feature of the webinar. If that technology, for those in the room, if that technology is not available to you or you're struggling with it, please raise your hand and a member of the CHREI team will come and work with you to get your question to the panelist. It is now with great pleasure that I turn to Dr. Sheila Cote-Meek, who is joining us virtually, to provide an introduction to the panelists. Good morning, Sheila.
Good morning, Marion. And I had a little glimpse of people a few minutes ago in the room, but I just want to say bonjour, and warm greetings. Welcome to the main panel event for Inclusion Week and to our invited guests. Before I get going too much on my opening words, I just want to thank Marion McGregor, the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights, Equity and Inclusion, as well as her team for putting together Inclusion Week. I know there's a lot of work and thought that goes into it. So a tremendous shout out to you and your team, Marion, for the awesome work. In keeping with our theme, this panel's title, What Does Social Justice Have to Do with It? The "it" in the sentences actually refers to decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in some cases, folks shorten that to EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the D in itself stands for decolonization, which is a recent addition to the York U EDI framework. This pointed question was asked on purpose to spark dialogue and conversation and also critical thought. We hope it serves as a provocation to engender a constructive discussion about the contradictions and overlaps between social justice and mainstream EDI frameworks. For example, in Beyond Tokenism and Objectivity, Theoretical Reflections on a Transformative Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Agenda for Higher Ed in Canada by Samuel Mugo and Korbala Puplapu, they note that universities are historically complicit with the reproduction of systemic inequality, and yet at the same time are also well positioned to address contemporary calls for EDI practices as part of institutional renewal practices. Being mindful that our own university embodies these contradictions, having earnest conversations about the valuable work of pushing for decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion can help us ensure that the work we do in furthering equity continues to be relevant, meaningful, thoughtful, and always intentional. Today's panel is just one of many events and interactive activities we have for this week's activities. We invite you to register while spots are still available. So right after this panel, there is also a keynote event led by Athletics and Recreation at the Second Student Center at 1:30, where the featured speaker is Olympian Mark Kesberry. And tomorrow, March 8th, which is also International Women's Day, our main keynote, Kiki Ojo Thompson, will address the main theme of reclaiming social justice with her presentation on reclaiming the transformative roots of DEDI/EDI. And this also will be an online event. On Thursday, March 9th, 2 in-person events will be held by the Schulich School of Business. There will be a discussion on the intersection of DEDI and business success from 12 to 2 p.m., as well as a campus tour in the afternoon led by the Graduate Student Collective. On Friday, March 10th, 2 more online events are taking place to close out the week. Amnesty International will lead a session of poetry highlighting the theme of decolonization titled Voices Unheard, centering marginalized voices in the university at 10 a.m. This will be followed by a ready session called Advancing Organizational Change to Foster a Culture of Belonging, which you can register for through YU Learn. Once again, thank you, merci, and miigwech for attending today's event. It is through listening and reflecting on diverse lived experiences and stories within the York community that each of us can make an impact within our community through taking up various initiatives related to DEDI. We look forward to a fruitful and engaged conversation. So just very briefly, our guest panelists today are Professor Susan Dion, the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives. Professor Dion is Lenape and Potawatomi scholar with mixed Irish and French ancestry and is the inaugural AVP of Indigenous Initiatives. And she was also the first Indigenous tenure track faculty member to be hired in the Faculty of Ed at York University. Professor Dion joined York in 2001 and was appointed to the rank of full professor in 2021. Rania Mugarmar, artist and anti-oppression consultant, is Sudanese artist, liberation educator, abolitionist, anti-oppression consultant, a multidisciplinary performer, speaker, and published writer. Her work explores reproductive justice, transformative justice, and abolition, art as liberation, and digital justice. Remy Warner is the director of Toronto Metropolitan University's Human Rights Services and has extensive experience in the fields of human rights, equity, anti-racism, and inclusion, especially in the public service sphere. And finally, Professor Jessica Sermon's Critical Disability Studies program is an assistant prof in the Critical Disability Studies program in the School of Health Policy and Management, Faculty of Health at York University. Her research makes critical interventions into the field of international experiential and service learning and global citizenship, engaging plural ideas of human rights, disability, and equity. Our moderator for this panel is senior advisors from the Center for Human Rights, Carol Ruiz. Carol, I turn it over to you now and look forward to the panel. Miigwech, merci, and thank you.
So welcome everyone, and we'll get started immediately. So all of our panelists are engaged in the work of social justice / DEDI and have backgrounds in what falls broadly, within social justice and equity. But we want to get to know them, a little bit better. So we'll be asking them to talk a little bit about their experience. Specifically, give us the 3-minute version if you can. This is the challenge. And then we'll get going. You can definitely add. Can you tell us the story of what led you where you are right now, your actual roles? But while you're at it, do tell us how you think about your work. Do you actually frame it within EDI, DEDI, or social justice, or both, right? So we want to know. Can I ask Susan first? Yes.
Good morning. This is so weird because you can't tell if it's on okay there. Nialongamati, Quinganawa Lomwa, Ni Dishinzi, Sheshkohalawas Dion, Non Jiai Nahi, Wak Toronto, Ni Dlana Pewe, Potwatome, Niha Nishminito, Anashik. So I introduced myself in one of my ancestral languages. I was speaking Lenape, and in Lenape I say Nialongamati, all my relations. And that statement I think is important for understanding that from Indigenous perspectives, that phrase, all my relations, it positions us in relationship to all of creation. I also say Sheshkohalawas, which is teacher, and that word is particularly important to me. I do think about myself as a storyteller and teacher. So maybe not sticking with the requirement to stay within the 3-minute, I'm going to tell a little story. So this happened because they did ask, how did you get here? And, we can't really answer that question in 3 minutes. But anyways, that question actually prompted a memory that I had of my mom telling me a story. I was about 12 when she told me this story about when I was born. Shortly after my birth, the family doctor who delivered me discovered that I had a tumor on my upper back. And he called for a consultation with a plastic surgeon. The doctor who was on call at the hospital came into the room to talk to my mother and the doctor, and looked at my mom and looked at the doctor and said, her? You want a plastic surgeon for her baby? The disdain on the doctor's face was so powerful that 12 years later, when my mother was telling me this story, I could feel, right, what she felt in that moment, the judgment that was being made about the worthiness of her life and her child's life. Well, fortunate for me, the family doctor who was in a relationship with my mom, knew my mom, had cared for my mom over multiple pregnancies, convinced the plastic surgeon, or the doctor on call, to call in the plastic surgeon. So I ended up with this tiny scar on my back, a tiny scar that I can't really even easily see. And yet the power of that scar, it reminds me, right, that colonialism lives on. The relationships that people have with each other and with knowledge systems, right? That doctor was acting on a belief that some life has greater value than other lives, right? He was acting on a hierarchy, right? And as a First Nations woman, right, my mother and her child were certainly not at the top of that hierarchy, right? Our lives mattered less. So that story of that incident that happened shortly after I was born is critical to how I got here, right? Because that's what drives my work, is that need and that desire to call into question, you know, how we understand ourselves in relationship with each other and with all of creation. So I'll talk more about that later, but I thought it was really important to start with a story and a chic.
Rania?
Thank you for that story. That was, I think it's nice to bring ourselves into a space like this by sharing how we came to be here, quite literally, right? So I'll take a cue from you how I came to be here. As I think to know how I came to this work, you have to first know that I was born in the Valley of the Nile, okay? My family is Rekabiya, Mahasiya, Bideriya, Dahmashiya, which are the nations or the tribes from which, you know, that brought me into existence. And that I'm the third generation of my family, actually the fifth generation of my family, but the third generation of my family formally to be engaged in like anti-colonial work of some kind, right? So I grew up in a really intensely political environment, and in an environment where my parents, and in particular my father, expected me to have an opinion and an informed one about things. So when I immigrated to Canada, so-called Canada, I came here in like just before September 11, 2001, right? And my name is Rania Al-Mujammar. There's no running away from my Muslimness, you know? It's right there. And my blackness is a mark of the flesh. That's right there too. So on the flight over, it was like back in the day, you know, 2001, they're playing Pocahontas on the airplane. And we're all stuck watching this same movie together. And my dad is like grilling me about it. And I'm like, dude, I'm not the one picking the movie, you know? Like, talk to the Air Canada people. Lay off of me, please, okay? But it was a really, he just asked me a lot of critical questions. And that is something my dad still does, and my family is really good at doing, is asking a lot of really critical and open-ended questions. And if you have a good answer, great. If you don't, prepare to be roasted at the dinner table. Like, it's very casual. So that part of it very much like sharpened my political consciousness and like my desire to ask questions. But I never set out to be a social justice educator. My entire life, all I have ever wanted to do was to write and tell stories. That's all I ever really wanted to do. Okay, I wanted to tell stories, and I mostly wanted to tell them for me, right? I grew up in the same house as my grandmother and my great-grandmother, which was an incredible gift for me. And in particular, my great-grandmother Aisha, like her life, just when I try to like take in the magnitude of her life, I feel overwhelmed by all of it. And so she silenced herself a lot in order for all of us to survive and to be possible. And so I felt like I owed it to her to like speak out and free all the women inside of me, right? So that was part of it. But in order to write, it became increasingly difficult to tell the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell them without everybody assuming that I was writing for an audience that wasn't me, right? So I just want to tell the story, but in order to tell the story, I'm like trying to make sure the space can hold the story. I'm trying to make sure the people in the space can engage with it. I'm trying to make sure the people for whom I'm writing are able to access that space, so on and so forth. So I think a lot of the times you informally end up doing a lot of this work, like everyday and organized resistance, just to be able to do the thing you came to do in the first place. And then eventually became incredibly clear that both the writing and the justice work were much in the same, right? I was just trying to make the invisible visible, and just give name to something that I knew lots of people understood innately, and just trying to find the language to talk about it and to learn about it. So that's kind of more or less how I came to be here.
Thank you. So, Jessica?
Oh, it's on. Okay, so thanks for this generative question to start. And Sheila, you said this thinking from our own story and thinking about what brought us here. And as Susan said, what literally brought you here. I just think it's such a beautiful way to start. And I just want to say I'm so honored to share space with each of you. I'll start with a visual description. I'm a white woman with long, dark blonde hair. My black glasses are on my head and I have a black face mask on, and we're all seated in these big red rolling chairs. I'm a mother of two, and I identify as an activist scholar. I just wanted to say I'm so pumped that this is hybrid. Access is everything. Mia Mingus reminds us that justice means including access info with event info, captioning videos, virtual access to in-person events because COVID's not over. I created a script for some of my answers because it helps me feel less anxious. I appreciate this format as a panel and the opportunity to create generative conversation and reflection together. I was also thinking about how it's a moment in time and the conversation could look different at a different time, as all of our thinking is always in community, growing and transforming. So I wanted to tell a little bit about, again, it's hard to do in 3 minutes, about where I come from, where my life story is, who my community is. So I grew up in an alternative, intentional social justice community. In the 70s, my parents were really big hippies and both looking for meaning and a way to live in solidarity. And so they met an intentional community called L'Arche. Some of you may or may not have heard about it. They're communities of people with and without intellectual disability labels sharing life together in homes. So in the 60s and 70s, L'Arche communities were given land from Catholic religious orders, and they eventually purchased homes, built workshops in order to sustain communities. And I love that story, Susan, that you tell about the beginning of your life. And I always hear the story about the beginning of my life, because one of the rituals in L'Arche was to have a Monday morning community meeting. So the whole community would meet together in the space we called the meeting house on a big farm just north of Richmond Hill. And so it happened that I was born on a Monday morning, and my father left the hospital. I was their firstborn, and ran into the meeting hall and said, "She's here." And the whole community was so excited. And so I was really born into a community of joy and of love. My elders were folks with intellectual disability labels, invited into community from really horrific institutional spaces. And so the idea was to really engage in different social relations together. So as I said, folks were welcomed from large institutions, places of horrific abuse and oppression. There's a documentary coming out called, or is out, called Unloved, Horonia's Forgotten Children. You can access it on CBC, and Critical Disability Studies is going to be doing a screening soon, so you can look for that. So I grew up in community, thinking about social justice, and about ways, as Susan talked about, how lives are, some lives are deemed less valuable. So I understood the world through this experience. So that's sort of how I come to this, and I guess too, in the academy, it's really hard to find and build community. That happens at margins, and it's full of tension. So I do find that difficult in the academy, coming from a place of community to an institution that sometimes actively tries to stop community. So that's a little bit over 3 minutes about where I come from. Thanks. Remy, over to you.
Over to you, Remy.
Thank you. It's great to be back at my old school here at York University. And, I used to hang around the political science department, just skip and hop across the hall there, and of course the anthropology department. So, when you ask these large questions in 3 minutes, and likewise, all my relations, there's so much that's shaped who we are today. I think this would just be a tidbit and a selective one that probably speaks to my own current identity and identifications. But certainly I think common to everyone here, my parents, my African Trinidadian father and my white British mother had a big influence on me, no doubt. They were also social activists, very much involved in the anti-war movement, anti-racist, anti-apartheid movement. And so they would bring our family along every, other week. We'd be at protests and sit-ins as a child, and quite reluctantly on my part, I must say, from a younger age, including Senate chambers during the kind of apartheid disinvestment moment in time. I remember that. Might have spent some time here, and so that certainly shaped me, and they were also shaped very much by deep ethical, faith-based commitments and coming out of liberation theology tradition. I think I was also shaped by my kind of popular culture of my time, coming up in the 90s and the emergence of hip-hop that sort of held out sort of new identifications and subject positions that, being formed by, Public Enemy, Fight the Power, Don't Believe the Hype, right? KRS-One, who taught us, you must learn. Yeah. And so, at that time, it was actually cool to learn and kind of, they put white supremacy squarely on the map for us in a way that registered and made it cool, like not school cool, but cool, right? And then finally I would say, my higher education at York University and elsewhere at Sussex has been formative, and it took that kind of deconstructive gaze that I was formed, just through my parents' influences and popular cultural influences to another level, right? And, with a little more rigor and unsettling some of my social justice certainties, right? So I worked with, I don't know if he's listening in, Professor Daniel Yon in the anthropology department. We'd call him the Black Foucault. And and he's a full-time deconstructionist, so I could never feel too secure in my thinking. But I think there's some benefit to that. But I was introduced to the kind of British cultural studies tradition, Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, of course the mandatory Marx and Foucault and Gramsci, but also the Black radical tradition and really being emergent. And that's still very much kind of a reading partner of mine to this day. So I'll leave it at that for sake of time.
Thank you so much. Judging from the chuckles there, your references in pop culture resonated around over there, I would say, right? So for the benefit of our audiences, I just wanted to say that, as Marian pointed out earlier, when we were looking at the story of how EDI, DEDI frameworks came to be in the post-secondary setting, is there's some literature, but there's a spot there that's empty, and this initiative, hopefully is part of the ethnography that we can contribute in telling the story. So I'll just wanted to tug a little bit more on the particular terminology of EDI, or even DEDI, if you should wish to comment on it. Because, so let me tell you a story. One of our placement students, Brandon, where are you? Brandon and I went to equity studies to have a chat with one of his professors. And, we were wondering if we were gonna trace the etymology of EDI, does equity studies actually use EDI? And can anybody guess the answer? Is it a term they use in equity studies? No. So not really surprised, but at the same time, makes our conversation kind of interesting, So what I wanted to ask our panelists, for instance, is you all talked about a very particular radical, influence, history, family especially. I think we lucked out on that. we did not know, everybody would have that kind of perspective. But in terms of the EDI part of DEDI, which terms, do you feel the most struggle with? Because it's, like I said, we investigated, it's not organically from the social justice movements that you were obviously referring to. And yet here we are, So I also came from human rights, more kind of a tradition. I won't reference the time because I'll also be dating myself, Grammy. But are you comfortable with the EDI in DEDI? Let's start with that. And what do you have issues with? And I'm looking at you, Rania. Maybe you should you should talk first. Yeah.
My issues are plenty. Here's the thing, right? I don't like any of the language. I don't, right? I think at the same time, two things are true. First, language matters. We have to think about the architecture of the language that we're using, who we center, what we privilege, what we think of as true, so on and so forth. And so from that perspective, right, equity, all right, fine, I guess. That's literally the floor, as my friend Mariam would say. It's the bare minimum, okay? That's literally the floor, okay? Equity is trying to offset some of the barriers that we have intentionally put into the world, right? And that piece around intentionally matters. Then secondly, diversity. According to whom? Diverse from what? It just fills me with questions, right? I also think diversity has been a narrative that is part of Canada's narrative of innocence, right? We tend to really euphemize, soften, rinse our history and our contemporary reality of so many truths that are so foundational to the consequences in people's lives at this particular moment, right? And those who came before them and those who will come after. So that's something that I think about often, is like this idea of diversity, and then like the violence of diversity, how so many of us are here just through displacement and colonization and global anti-blackness and capitalism and neo-imperialism, so on and so forth, that how the diversity came to be is not necessarily cause for celebration. How some of us were brought here, how we came to be here. Right? We would call this mashettat in Sudanese, or like scattered like seeds in the wind, right? That's what happened to most of us. And then inclusion. Inclusion is the one that irks my spirit the most. No, it really does, right? Like people, I attended this panel online, and it was some like NGO, and the panel was taking place in Sudan, talking about like being inclusive of Sudanese people in like international aid work happening in Sudan. And I was like, this is very bold. I like it. I mean, I just like the boldness of it all, right? But, and then we talk about including Indigenous people on their own lands. And also, do I want to be included in your nonsense? I don't think, I would in fact rather you leave me out of it, right? Sometimes the language of inclusion says, come as we are, right? So what part of yourself do you have to borrow from our sister and elder bell hooks to psychically mutilate in order to be in a particular space? Right? You don't have to be white-minded, but you don't have to be white, but you have to be white-minded. So you can be in this space where you're constantly trading in a part of yourself in order to be so-called included. Right? So the language itself, I think, is generally troubling, but the bigger picture here, or the other side of that truth, is that language is always falling short of encompassing the fullness of our lives and the radical transformations that are necessary for us. And part of that is like my beef with English in general. Like as a language, the architecture of the language tells you a lot about the values of the culture. So it doesn't surprise me as like a multilingual person that English is so limiting in its ability to like talk about freedom, right? Or like to conceive of it in the language itself. I think it tells a lot. It's not a very relational language. Sudanese Creole is incredibly relational. When we ask somebody how you are, we ask in the plural. Right? It's not a royal we, you know, but we're asking you because we recognize your wellness is directly connected to the wellness of the people you are in community with. You're not okay if your mama's sick, right? You're not okay if your sibling is struggling. Yeah, you're not okay if your community is in crisis, so we recognize that. So I think some of that is like just the architecture of English in the ways that it's like developed under global white supremacy, capitalism, so on and so forth. And then the last thing that I'll say is systems of injustice are really good at co-opting radical language and smoothing its sharp edges over and making it toothless and disconnecting it from its radical roots. Some of the language that we do use in so-called DEI or whatever you want to call it is like really radical black thought, like radical black feminist thought in particular, right? And then we kind of like, you know, just shift it a little bit, disconnect it from the context that it came from, and use it to mean things which are more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. So for me, it's not language that I've generally used to describe my work. It doesn't, I think it describes a set of things that we can more or less predict. Like when I ask people in any workshop, what are people doing to be like equitable? Okay. How many of you are getting committed to death right now? Okay. How many people are putting out solidarity statements? How many of us are attending diversity trainings? How many people are being appointed as equity officers? Okay? And officers really irritates me too. Why? What kind of powers do you have? Suspicious. Okay? But just some of that framework, I think is just, we just lack, and especially in like universities, like just get irked, like there's so much capacity for critical thought. Why do we keep doing things that are potentially not working? Or the same things we've been doing for 40 years. None of this is new, it's just getting new language around it, but a lot of the practices have stayed the same. So my trouble with language, I think, is like perpetual in general, but it's not necessarily language I use to describe my work. I think most of the time I think of it as political education, right? Like I want people to have sharp political analysis, a sharp political consciousness, and an ability to think of themselves in relation to other people. And I don't know what you call that, but but that's what I'd be doing, that's all.
Yeah, I really think we're getting somewhere now. But I love what you said about the need for relational language. And I think I'd like to hear Susan weigh in on this as well.
Well, yeah, I think that absolutely relational language and understanding the significance of being in relationship with each other. And like if we really started to think about what that meant and how it would change, how it could, the potential change that it could activate, I think is critical. I want to, when you asked this question, I thought about, you know, in the York University Land Acknowledgement, there's a reference to the dish with one spoon treaty. And, you know, the significance of that treaty, it often gets talked about in terms of, you know, sharing the resources of the land, right? Like that, there's the land, the dish is the land, and we have to share the resources of the land with each other. But the meaning of that treaty is much deeper, right? It calls us to pay attention to who is around, right? Who is around the dish, but also the dish itself. How do we value, right, and see ourselves and live our lives in relationship to the land, to the water, to the air, right? So it really requires a shift in our thinking, right? That we have a responsibility to observe, to pay attention to each other, and to the land itself, and to see ourselves in relationship with and having a responsibility with to live in relationship with each other, the land, the water, and that there is a reciprocity in that. And I love what you said about the, like when you ask how you are, it's, yeah, you can't be well if we're not attentive to each other and to the land, and that all lives are dependent on that respectful, reciprocal relationship. Yeah, so I think, yeah, when you hear that land acknowledgement and you hear that reference, you know, that's a call to pay attention and accept responsibility and acknowledge that your well-being and your being well can only be accomplished when we're attentive to the collective well-being.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. So what I'm drawing from the sharing so far is that, you know, for the most part, what it serves, especially the D and the I in the conversation, is something that we need to be challenging, be more critical of, you know. So my proposal, and this is just mine, is maybe treat it like placeholder language, right? We shouldn't be content with it, and to entertain these challenges. I just wanted to draw attention as well that focusing on relationships also makes us attuned to the power relationships, as is pointed out. And sometimes, you know, the language is connected also with which framework has weight, right? Which one is dominant. And now I'm looking at you, Remy, from the law, from the legal perspective. Sometimes it actually can seem like when you're engaged in social justice work, especially when you're working in an institution, that we're navigating different but connected frameworks nonetheless, right? So we even have a human rights framework, which is also a legal framework. So do you see any advantages or limitations to just using human rights language, for example, or even treating them as if they're equivalent to each other, right? So does it leave any room for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's telling in that one study of EDI in higher ed that only 5 out of something like 15 or 21 institutions actually define their terms of reference. And I think it's that very malleability that allows it to default to the status quo reproduction of systems as they are, with some new paint, and sometimes, if you're lucky, there might be some renovations, right? But my sense of history, and I'd be happy, you know, I'm sure there's multiple histories and threads. My sense is that first there was diversity. Like the order is actually diversity, which emerges, right, in opposition to a legal, normative, social justice-based framework, right, rooted in legislation, struggles over employment equity, struggles over the state, right? It emerges in this 70s as a neoliberal backlash, right? And then it gets retranslated, right, as, well, how can this be good for business and serve, right, business interests and the like. And I think, of course, etymology is not destiny necessarily. And so I take your point that you can use it as a placeholder and it can function like a floating signifier. That's kind of its strength and weakness, because in the context and the interlocutors are such that a prevailing interpretation tends to take hold. So you have diversity, then you have inclusion. People said, well, it's not just diversity, we want people to feel included too, right? Then it's only more recently that I started, and this is in my experience in the Ontario public sector, Ontario Human Rights Commission, right, in the prison system. Then I think equity was added on to, and that was a struggle, a more recent one. That's my sense. And my hope is that the final D decolonization, right, could be the most transformative. I believe it is, and I'm very hopeful about that framework. Now, that said, I do work within a human rights-based approach, which I wouldn't suggest is equivalent with the law, because I mean, you look at the history of these rights traditions, right? They emerge as revolutionary movements and ethical ideals. Yes, arguably first, and there's all kinds of deeper histories that one could reconstruct, but in terms of the dominant modalities of human rights, you know, you have these rights, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, right? And really sort of the rights of white propertied men, right? In opposition to the ancient regimes, kind of taking predominance. And of course, human rights has been shaped by those legacies and even its kind of liberal individualist ontologies and that are kind of, you know, very much go against the relational model. And I see that limitation, but at the same time, I'm not prepared to give the baby of human rights up with the bathwater of its historical Eurocentrism, because I do, and even someone like Walter Mignolo, you know, arch theorist of decoloniality, you know, who calls human rights a kind of a provincial Euro-American project, right? Like in its more recent incarnation. But yet the human can still, you know, there's another chance to define the human, right? So yes, it can be a situated universal. We never arrive there, but we're reaching to kind of a global theory of justice, but always situated, always in relationship. I think, so there's room for human rights to be decolonized, but I think some of the strengths of this framework, the human rights framework in particular, strategically, is because it foregrounds the intrinsic value of education as a public good, which is running against the neoliberal grain, right? So all of this EDI is happening at a time of public disinvestment in education, new funding models that have come in that are all about universities showing, right, that, you know, economic gain, etc. So it's a bit ironic that this is happening at the same time, right, as the rise of neoliberal inequality. And so it really confronts that, but it also allows for a broad resistance, collecting the local and global, and it can accommodate deep diversity, I believe, right? So sometimes there's a risk in sort of social justice work to be, you know, I guess a kind of a politics of purity, you could say, right? Where, you know, well, if they don't subscribe to this, they should be kicked out of the university, right? And I think human rights does, within its tradition, provide a space for the balancing and coexistence of, you know, what Ralston Saul calls, you know, diverse comprehensive doctrines, right? And that they could coexist. There's more I could say, but I've said too much, so.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to draw attention to what you said, that human rights needs to be decolonized as well. And in fact, you know, shameless plugging, Brandon again takes credit. We are developing a podcast, a very short one, that curates certain resources for you to start learning about, you know, if that's something new to you, thinking around decolonizing human rights itself, the way we understand it, its history as well.
The 1960 Declaration, right?
Yes.
Decolonization of, right, the former colonial states. That 1916 declaration, that's a human rights declaration, yes, too, right? So I mean, not to say it exhausts decolonial theory, right? But
yes. So definitely a good conversation. Now, at this point, I think, Jessica, I'd like you to weigh in, because your scholarship particularly is situated in North-South encounters, right? So, of course, in the field of health and critical care, community and disability. And one of the key principles I remember you mentioning in your work is that you engage plural ideas of human rights and equity, right? So it actually speaks to the point Rania made about the limitations of our limitations here, talking in the global north, you know, in English, about these things, what justice means, right? Could you explain what you mean by the pluralism part, especially when it comes to human rights, equity, and disability.
So Jessica here. I just first wanted to take up that piece from me around purity politics and how it's so embedded in like white supremacy and this idea of, you know, throwing people out as if they're disposable. And I think for me, like, you know, when I was invited to come on this panel as a white woman, it's like, what? You know, like EDI work is being so encroached upon by white folks. And I think, you know, I just thought and struggled, and there's this great podcast called Maintenance Phase. And in one of the episodes, Michael Hobbs calls white women middle managers of oppression. And, you know, that's like the academy. Like, let's just call it that, right? Woo! And so it, you know, this question of struggle around framing your work, for sure, as a white woman, it's like, where should I be doing this work? Where should I be speaking? And so I think for me as a white woman, we have to do things. We can't just think it's too hard. We can't just, you know, are not doing it perfect enough. So we just leave it and leave the work for others. And we need to listen to entry points being identified by BIPOC folks and then show up to do that work. And like Rania says, like that's like committee work in the institution now, right? And so it's a struggle to try to not get co-opted into that. And I think the logics of the institution often narrowly define what we can do. And our job is to push back and say, no, like we're not even talking about that. That's not actually equity work. That isn't going to serve students. That isn't going to serve faculty. And so really thinking about like who we organize with, how we organize in ways that aren't tokenistic, and especially as like white folks, how do we call each other in and keep each other accountable? And I love that piece, Rania, how you talk about like equity officers, like borrowing that like policing, surveilling language. And I think that's, I think that's very much where EDI work can go to in the institution, right? It can be cop-like. And so we're here to teach, we're here to mentor, we're here to create spaces for liberatory education. And a lot of what I'm thinking about in terms of like even getting to do DEI work is around access. And so we need to figure out how students can access learning in ways that it's not harmful, where they're not being policed and surveilled. So, you know, most folks will know like ChatGPT just came on the scene, and the immediate reaction from faculty is how can we surveil students harder so they can't use ChatGPT, right? So the Teaching Commons here at York just put on a webinar about it. I think there's about 200 folks that came, which is a large amount of folks to come out for a teaching workshop. And, you know, the chat was a lot of there was a lot of discussion in the chat about how we're going to detect students, how we're going to figure out when students are using it or not. And one person asked the question, is that how you want to be in relation to your students? So I think there's just so many places where we can fall into surveillance, and especially as white folks, we're like really drawn towards that. And so I think a lot about this idea of how do we do DEI work when students can't access childcare, when they can't access housing. We have so many houseless students on campus. Right now, York Security Services is doing a review. One of the big pieces of the review is the way that security is interacting with houseless folks on campus. So how are we doing DEI work with folks that can't access childcare to even get to educational spaces? Students are accessing food banks at like huge levels. So really just thinking about this idea of how we're even doing DEI in an institution when social justice is just, shaping the lives of folks in such intimate ways. So I think we do, thank you, Susan, for this invitation to think relationally. I remember going to a workshop with you in ways that you do relationality in your classroom spaces, right? And so I think it's really calling each other to that, to these small spaces where we can create relationship in the institution. And this idea that access is never done. It's always something that we're continuously doing, always ongoing. We have a really narrow imagining of access in the academy. So we think about it in terms of accommodating students into our racist, ableist system, or we think about it in terms of universal design for learning, which often, is sort of one and done. And I've heard so many stories from students saying, I needed something specific, and my prof responded with, I've created this course using universal design, so it must be universal. When a student is looking you in the face and telling you, I can't access your course, that is your response. So I think, I'll end in a minute, but I think this idea around collective access is so hard to build in an institution that the only way this institution understands access is through individual accommodation. So during the pandemic, so many of us needed collective access in really big ways. And when we went into bargaining for, when the tenured faculty just went into bargaining for a collective agreement, one of the things the union did was open a conversation around how do we have collective access? And the answer is you'll never win that through a collective bargaining process. Only individual access. And so even though all of us, a bunch of us in this room might have the same needs, we all have to waste our time going through a process, giving documentation, telling people trauma in order to get access through an accommodation. Instead of saying, right, how much did we learn during this pandemic about collective access and ways we could care for each other? So I think for me, it's just so difficult to even talk about EDI when there's just so much limit to ways that each of us from our own social location are even able to access this institution. So that's just what's been weighing on me and thinking about and coming from what other folks are talking about. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. And again, for referencing what the other panelists were talking about, but I wanted to ask Susan, and while EDI has been around a bit, and it's, we agree that's what we're working with right now, we continue to be critical. I heard Remy say that adding the D, at least for some universities, the decolonization creates an opportunity, right? And it's something very kind of obvious, right? That we are critiquing EDI because we decided to add the D. Just a note: if my current self traveled to see my undergrad self, student activist, and you told me that we would soon be talking about decolonization, in a mainstream way, I wouldn't have believed you, coming from the global South. So, of course, in your experience, what do you think opportunities there could be for adding the D in EDI, right? Is it, let's get specific, for instance, what would be a good change to see if we were, to take up the challenge of decolonization?
Right. So one of the things that this discussion has been making me think about is the EDI. And I always think, well, what is it that we're inviting, right? If we're talking about inclusion and we're inviting a diversity of people to come to the university and access what the university has to offer, well, what is it that we're offering? And, I remember as a new academic here at York in 2001, I was asked to address Indigenous student recruitment and to create, an education program that would invite students, Indigenous students to attend. And I took a look around York and I was like, I am not inviting Indigenous students to come here. Why would I do that? This is not a safe enough space, and the knowledge that we are offering is not the knowledge that I want to offer to Indigenous students. I mean, I think the significance specifically of decolonizing the university calls on us to think about and to question what is the knowledge that we're offering. And decolonizing requires us to think seriously about the knowledge that we're offering and whose knowledge is deemed legitimate, in our classrooms. And it's so limited what it is that we value as legitimate knowledge. And I think that within the discussions about decolonizing, I don't think we pay enough attention to the need to think about what knowledge we have on offer here. And it doesn't, sometimes professors will, my colleagues will say to me, oh, well, I teach in math, so, that doesn't really impact me, or I'm, teaching biology, and I know decolonizing is important in history, but it doesn't matter in math or engineering. And I'm like, what if you taught a class and you discussed with your students the technology of the snowshoe, or the technology of the canoe? I mean, it's requires you to think differently about what informs your understanding of knowledge. So I think for me, that's one an important element of decolonizing that we don't think enough about. But I mean, of course, it's really important to talk about decolonizing as requiring a return of land and resources, and end to the violence that's continually being perpetrated against Indigenous women, girls, and children. And the divesting of power back to Indigenous people. Addressing anti-Indigenous racism. I'm drawing here on Sheila Cote-Meek's book and her definition of decolonizing. We also have to think about dismantling the heteronormative gender system, systemic ableism and ageism. And I think a lot about even now when I meet with prospective PhD students who are finishing and thinking about joining the academy, and talking a lot about the competitive structure of being in the academy, and how I think that's one of the most important issues that when Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, when we come together in a specific space, that I've seen it happen. I've seen, a transformation of an academic meeting when we sit in circle and we participate in ceremony and we come together with good hearts and good minds to address our own challenges, that we can leave that competitiveness, outside of the circle. but it's hard. It is really hard to escape that, because it's so much permeates the work of the academy, is that the way that we are constantly put in, competition with each other. Yeah, so I think that in thinking about decolonizing and the work and what decolonizing has to offer, those are some of the key, the key issues that I think about and want others to think about with me, is what damage does that competitiveness do to our relationships with each other, and how might we think about creating spaces where we can do our work outside of that competitiveness. But it's almost impossible. But I hold on to the fact that it can happen, because I've seen it happen.
Thank you for that. And what it's making me think about the conversation about the importance of relationality, especially in knowledge creation, and connecting that with what Jessica said about the rugged individualism. It also comes off in the way we are treated in the university, by the university, and also how we're sort of led to also think for ourselves as that and function, right, in competition. And these are very different ways of knowing, being relational on purpose, and positional, being authentic, telling people, this is where I come from, right? This is the story, instead of denying that there's a story and not revealing yourself, right? So these are two very different things. What would it take, for instance, in the post-secondary education system? Maybe think about which groups of people need to really challenge themselves the most, right? Because these are things that, students, faculties, maybe in the union setting, or staff are already thinking about. We're certainly struggling with the EDI limitations of the language and the work that we do as educators at REI. But what about the university? If we were to take a step back, which stakeholders, which groups would you think? And this is for nobody in particular. All of the panelists are invited to weigh in. Where do you think is the most urgent change we can call for example?
I'm going to speak briefly, and then I'll pass it on to someone. I think, okay, so the first thing that I'll say is we need to shift our perspective from this idea that universities are historically complicit in building systems of white supremacy. They're contemporarily, presently complicit in doing those things, right? So I think historicizing injustice is something we have to push back against. And then also really ground our understanding in the truth. I don't want to argue about asinine nonsense like, is there injustice in our institution? Like, why is that the question we're starting from? Are you not on planet Earth? Were you like exempt from the last 500 plus years of history, right? So that's the thing. I think allowing ourselves to turn past page one and not be perpetually stuck on page one just because someone is, right? And that doesn't mean leaving people behind. It means giving people the tools they need to take responsibility for their own teaching and learning when it comes to justice, without expectation of teaching and reward in really informal settings, meaning you corner the one Indigenous person and you're like, so colonialism. Tell me about it, right? Nobody wants to be on the receiving end of that, right? And I think a big part of it is an unjust economy of labor. The way that we've structured justice work is self-selecting, right? You self-select because you literally are suffering the consequences every single day, and you feel like if I don't do it, who will, right? You self-select because, frankly, you could get a lot of clout and a platform, and if you really want to, you can make money doing this work. You really could. I mean, you gotta trade in a little piece of your soul while you're at it. But you definitely can get a massive platform. I think it's a really strange moment of like celebrity activism and social justice organizing that doesn't make sense. You should attach yourself to values and ideals and not people, right? People will let you down. And that's okay, they're people. That's kind of the point. People are allowed to be flawed and imperfect. And then recognizing that like the economy of risk has been so slanted, right? People who are experiencing and living their lives at the intersections of these injustices pay the harshest consequences for speaking up against them. Right? So those of us with the biggest privileges have the responsibility to take the biggest risks. Not all of us pay the same price for resistance. I would say also really shifting from a linear and prescriptive approach to justice. There are no 5 best practices that will decolonize you, right? Somebody sent me the other day an article on decolonizing the monarchy. The monarchy. I was like, words mean things. I just want you to know that, okay? And the monarchy? Like, don't play with me, okay? I really don't. I don't want to die young because it must have been, frankly. I was like, this can't be a real life. Okay, like wake me up when it's over. I'm done with this. But this prescriptive thing that really limits our imagination. Sometimes the solutions and the interventions we need are not best practices, are not corporatized EDI frameworks. They are things that people have always done. You know, my aunties do those things. They don't call it mutual aid or solidarity. They call it doing what needs to be done. Right? And they just do it anyhow. So recognizing the value in that, and I think really recognizing the value in care labor, right? Feminized labor, women's work in the world, right? The single most devalued form of work there is and the single largest economic backbone of human existence. That work does not require us to have the perfect political analysis to show up for each other, right? Right after I leave here, I'm gonna go link up with my friend G. We're gonna make some moose meat lasagna for elders. And that's part of that care work, right? Is we want our elders to survive, to see the world we want to build as much as they can. And then lastly, just really resisting carceral logic in the way that we do this work, right? I think, several of my friends up here have spoken about this already, but really resisting the urge to be punitive in this work, right? When we punish people, and I'm not gonna talk about cancel culture, I get a question about it every time, I don't think it's real. The real cancellation is death, and I know who's nearest that most days. However, we do live in a culture of disposability, where people who perhaps even haven't had the opportunities to learn the things that we've learned, right, or to have access to the language that we have access to, that part of that politics of purity, get thrown out, right? Who could just as easily be our co-conspirators under the right circumstances. Right? Punishment doesn't transform people. It changes them, but it doesn't transform them, and that's not the same thing. So I think those are the big things for me, because all of these things really capture our imagination, right? They coax us into the idea of inevitability, underpinned by the myth of scarcity. There's not enough for all of us to survive, and so we fight each other, we get competitive, we fight for the one academic opportunity that's available, for the one subsidized housing thing that's available, so on and so forth. But if we reject that and begin fundamentally from the assertion that this is a life of abundance, there's more than enough for all of us to survive, it becomes very clear where our energy should go, right? Which is not to fighting each other, so on and so forth. But I think the structure of the university itself, the funding models of the university itself, the focus on quote unquote merit, the myth of objectivity and neutrality, all of those things come together to make the siren song of apathy. If there isn't enough for all of us, and all of this is inevitable, and we only have terrible choices, why bother, right? I think resisting those things moves us a little bit further away from I do because I'm good, or the exceptionalism in that politics of purity. I'm better than this group of people that I belong to, because I'm exceptional and I'm one of the good people and I'm an ally, right? The most insufferable, unteachable people you'll ever meet. And then shifting towards I do for the collective good. Like, justice is good for me. Like, I may not need barrier-free access now, but if I'm lucky enough to age one day, I may need that, right? I live in the crux of climate crisis like we all do. That is a disabling world. I may very well need that one day, right? I wanna be a good auntie in the present, okay? And not just an aunt to like my actual nephews, but also just like a community auntie, You know what that means? Like, people are your cousin. Some of them are your cousin, and some of them are just your cousin. That's what I mean by that. And then also a good ancestor. Like, those are the things I want to be, right? So what are the choices that I can make from that position? And, you know, the university can be a site of resistance. It doesn't have to be our only site of resistance. Like, academia is not going to free us. We're not going to get an academic publishing, you know, several books that are going to decolonize the world. But it can definitely be a critical site of resistance, like everywhere we are, whether you're, you know, a greeter at Walmart, whether you are a seasonal agricultural worker, whether you do mother work, whatever it is you do, can be a site of resistance.
Thank you. I do believe that we have, you know, a few minutes if you wanted to weigh in as well, but we can actually shift to audience questions at this point. So, first of all, I hope you've been placing your questions, and so, by the magic of technology, I have one here, right here. Okay, so what suggestions do you have in keeping DEDI work alive in unfavorable political climates? So that question came from the room. I guess some of this also touches on the tokenism that was mentioned, you know, by the panelists. You know, so there's always a danger of tokenistic approaches. So what suggestions might you have in keeping the DEDI work alive, you know, especially in the face of a challenge, I guess, an unfavorable political environment? And you don't have to be talking specifically about your own university. Can be uncomfortable, but any comments?
Yeah, so, you know, there's no easy answer. I think, you know, everyone here has suggested that. And the idea that the answer will come from exclusively from within the institutional site because we had the right tools and we had the best idea, and therefore it's going to be transformative. You know, not to be too pessimistic, ideas matter, and the intellectual labor that's happening right here in terms of challenging, deconstructing these kinds of you know, frameworks in the way that they invite us to join the competition, right? Essentially. But really, just in my experience, like over the last 20 years, working in the prison system, working, you know, on the anti-racism legislation, data standard, nothing I ever was able to do or contribute to with some modicum of success happened without like the social movement. Banging the pavement, banging the doors, showing up on the premier's office. And I could literally tell you that, you know, the day before when I was in cabinet office, they were saying, you know, nice idea, but never, right? Are we going to have anti-racism legislation or even a strategy? We'll just, well, I got to be careful, I'm still under oath, but yeah. But then the next day, right? Boom, BLM shows up, right, on the front lawn, right, at 40 College, fires are blazing, right? Anyone who made Daniel Spectrum, who showed up that day and saw what happened with the mayor. And then the next day, we're going to do legislation. Color of Poverty, right, Color of Change comes out with a, you know, prescription of what that should look like. I almost, you know, went with that almost wholesale, right, with little modification. So it's I've never seen it happen otherwise, but I think like the intellectual work to be done is to move us beyond what Sayla Ben Habib, she's a Turkish American feminist political philosopher, she calls, you know, politics. This is drawing from an article by Gregory Barassa where he cites this. Moving from a politics of fulfillment to a politics of transfiguration. That's intellectual work. And what is that, according to Ben Habib? A politics of fulfillment, and this is, EDI is completely in this space. And before we know it, I mean, decoloniality, anything could, human rights, everything can be put within this politics of fulfillment space. A politics of fulfillment envisages that society of the future attains more adequately what the present society has left unaccomplished. It is the culmination of the implicit logic of the presence. It does not contest the configuration or formation of society or its institutional structures. It merely demands the structure or formation be inclusive. A politics, in contrast, the politics of transfiguration emphasizes the emergence of qualitatively new needs, social relations, modes of association, which burst open the utopian potential within the old. Anyway, I mean, you know, we're talking about transformation. And transformation, yes, you have to have the ideas, and I have some ideas about the idea, but it doesn't happen without the people. It will never happen without the people, and because I had the best toolkit, and I was just such a genius because I studied culture, race, and difference at Sussex University on a Commonwealth scholarship, etc. But that's a start. Build with the people. Like whatever you do, bring them in, right? Because when it's you and it's inside baseball, it's a losing game, right? You're not gonna win that, and I'm losing.
Thank you for that quote. I'm actually a fan, Sayla Ben Habib. The fulfillment thing is also very indicative of the capitalist setting, right? Like you think about what product you don't have now, you just fulfilling a need instead of rethinking, is this all there is? Definitely want to read that book now. Can we have that book, Marian?
Critique Norman Utopia.
So now this is a very interesting question because I think it's like, you know, something that a lot of graduate students get challenged on, making an elevator pitch about your thesis, right? So what would you tell somebody, you know, good person, for all intents and purposes, well-meaning, but they feel that because they don't partake in discrimination, well, and injustice, therefore it's not a problem, right? Like it's not something that's so immediate or they feel connected to. What would you tell that person, you know, or in other words, how would you tell them to get over it? For example. And have you encountered such people? I think you mentioned that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, it depends on whether people demonstrate a capacity to be teachable or not, right? That's something, because not because they're never gonna be teachable, it's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, do I have the skills, knowledge, fortitude, bandwidth, and desire to engage with this person right now? And are they demonstrating at least the desire to meet me halfway? Right? At least the desire to listen with the intention to understand. Right? That's all I need from you. I'm not gonna talk to someone who gets thrills out of arguing for the sake of arguing, for example. There's a finite amount of energy and an infinite number of jerks in the world. Okay, so I wanna be really mindful about how I use that energy. And who knows, maybe they'll do some other learning in which a conversation with me in the future could be beneficial to them, but maybe I just don't have what it takes right now, and they don't have the foundation it takes to learn what I have to offer. Okay? So that's the first thing that I'll say. The second thing that I'll say is it's all our business. Our sense of individualism has assigned individual responsibility for systemic issues, right? To the point where I can say, I'm not an anti-Semite, so none of that has anything to do with me. Right? I'm not Islamophobic, none of that has anything to do with me. When we talk about things like anti-racism or anti-oppression, these are action words, anti. Right? I'm actively recognizing that I live inside a system that operates regardless of my individual attitude or behavior. That's the distinction there. Do I understand the systemic nature of injustice? Right? And then the other thing that I think is important is like a shift from guilt to responsibility. Like so often people will come and say to me, well, I can't be responsible for what my ancestors did. Can't ya though? But people feel really guilty about their ancestors, and they feel like, well, it's something that happened in the past and there's nothing I can do to change it. When in reality, I'm not asking you to go back and change the past. Okay, I wouldn't even trust you with that, FYI. But what I am asking you to do is to ask yourself, how are you in relation to people right now? Right? Even if when we talk about something like decolonization, a lot of the times what we're describing is relationships. Are you going to reorganize your relationships to people in a way that leans towards justice or not? right? If I'm moving from I do because I'm good and I'm moving towards I do for the collective good, I have to do it because I care about my well-being also. If it's a favor or if it's charity, it's conditional, it can be withdrawn, it's paternalistic, there's no agency in it. There's a lot of that that's unfolding. And then also I think inviting more people, I think our spaces could be a lot less self-righteous. And better at inviting people into their learning in like really transformative and generous ways. I think so often people come in with the desire to learn, or at least with the foundation. And for me, the foundation is I believe people deserve to live a life free from violence. That's like the kind of like basic bare minimum thing that I want from people, even if they're not, you know, at the place where they're pro-Black liberation or whether they're trans affirming. They don't have that language or that understanding yet, but they're in that place. There is potential, I think, and our spaces could be a lot better at bringing people along with us, could be a lot better at making the language and the learning that we do more accessible. I think that's something I've learned a lot throughout my career. Like people, more than 1 million people have come to my workshops over the last 20 years. Right? And I've learned something extraordinary in that, which is that if you have the kind of space that invites people to speak from their location and from the experiences that they have, if you have the kind of space that is done through an ethic of care, right? And that includes things like accessibility and not making people ask, right? I know people are in my community who are deaf and hard of hearing, right? I know there are people who are have diagnosed and undiagnosed neurodivergencies in my community. I know there are people with all sorts of mobility access needs. So if I start to build a learning space with that understanding in mind, I'm already in community with these people are already my kin, then my sense of responsibility shifts a little bit and we can build the kinds of spaces that bring people along. Honestly, I've seen people that I've had like political discourse, really like expansive political discourse with that left me feeling dizzy, right? Who themselves do not have like the political language or the academic language that we might use right now, but through an invitation into the conversation could really articulate to me what I would call like an anti-imperialist worldview, but they wouldn't necessarily use that language, but could see that it's actually their business and they're a part of it too, right? And so some of that learning for me has taken place in like very small rural communities. The kinds of places we assume in the imagination of the academy are like the places where people don't get it, right? So I think that kind of like shift in our how we learn and how we talk about it can help. But generally speaking, you know, you're not going to be able to bring someone along who doesn't want to learn. Like, and you just got to leave them. I've been that person too, right? Like, I think we can all look back at our lives and been like, man, I was unteachable and kind of insufferable at many times in my life. And so how do I work on being teachable and model what it looks like to be teachable? I think that can help people too.
That's like me and Excel. Okay. Yes, Susan, did you want to?
I just wanted, did you want to? No. Okay, yeah, that question really also makes me think about the question of mandated courses, right, at the university, because that's a question that I get asked often, and I really come from a place of you cannot mandate learning. You really, and the research shows this, and with mandated courses, I mean, you know, one of the questions that I often ask my Indigenous colleagues is, do you want to teach that course? And we're all like, no, we do not want to teach mandated courses because you get those people who are simply not in a place where they are ready to accept the invitation to learn. So I think that our energies are much more productive and useful when we work with people who are interested in accepting the invitation to learn, right? But I also think that we need to keep doing the work. And, you know, as an educator, I have accepted a pedagogical responsibility. I do that work. That's my responsibility as Sheshkohalawas to teach. And so I do invite people to learn but I'm conscious of where people are coming from. Right? When I first started doing the work that I do around, rethinking the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, Indigenous colleagues often said, like, Susan, why are you bothering with, why are you interested in, working with white teachers? And it's like, well, these white teachers are teaching our kids. So I do care about what they know and don't know about us. And my kids go to school with a whole lot of settler kids with settler teachers. So the environment that they're in, I care deeply about. And so I have accepted this responsibility. But I think that we invite people. We teach and we invite people to learn from and with us. But I don't want to waste my time and energy talking with people who haven't seen that they are implicated in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on these lands. But I do invite people, and I do feel strongly that if you live on this land, you are in a relationship with us, whether you're willing to acknowledge it or not. And I do get asked a lot about recent newcomers to this lands and what are their responsibilities, and this question of, well, my family just came yesterday. I'm not implicated in that history. But, the truth is that this land was made available for you to come here and have a life because we were removed from the land. We were forcibly removed, in most cases, from the land that you now can come and make a life on. So you are in a relationship with us, whether you know it or not, and we invite you to engage with our knowledge, to engage with our stories, and to learn from and with us. And that's, I think, how progress in the decolonizing long journey is going to be accomplished. And I think about the work of those who have come before me, right? The activists, the artists, the educators who have come before me and made a path for me to follow to do the work. Like my mom and what she lived and what she experienced, being born on a reserve in the late 1920s, what her experience was is different from my experience, is different from my children and grandchildren's experience. But my children and grandchildren can walk a path that in lots of ways has been cleared by my ancestors and the artists and activists and educators who came before. So I just, that's a long answer to this question, and I've kind of, rambled here and there, but I think inviting people and creating opportunities for people to see the ways in which they're implicated in this relationship is where I start from.
Yes, thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks. So, sorry, just waiting for the mic to come on. So I think this, this idea in white supremacy that we're going to be like rewarded for this work. And so I think, Rania, you're receiving way more horrific response than me as a white woman is, right? Like that, this idea that we're going to be celebrated or rewarded for doing actual EDI or access work, it's not going to happen. And if you are celebrated and rewarded, your work is probably not that radical, right? Because the institution, for all the, there's the mic. Sorry, the mic just came on for translation. So I think, this idea that the institution, the change that happens in the institution is from the streets, is from like Sarah Ahmed's work around complaints, right? Whose bodies have to take that labor on to make complaints in institutions like this, to have, like you said, Susan, what folks have now. Students, like Rania and I were saying, and Carol, Chris Smalls is coming on Friday with YFS, right? Angela Davis was brought by York Federation of Students. That's who's pushing change in institutions. It's coming from, it's not coming from the institution itself, because of course the institution is built on like infinite growth, on having to make money, and access costs money, right? Equity costs money. So I think, I go back to this piece by Eve Tuck in 2018 called Biting the University That Feeds Us. It's so great. It's in a book called Dissident Knowledge in Higher Ed. And she asked this question: what do I want to be doing when I'm not bathing my children? And Rania, like, I've been following your work for so long, like I said, in your work around parenting and parenting in anti-racist ways, abolition in parenting, and like, do I want to be sitting on a committee that's going to do the same conversations that happened 20 years ago when I'm not bathing my children? And so I think, you know, there's this term now like moral stress or even moral injury for folks who are trying to do like countercultural work in an institution that is built to stop that work. And so I think, I think it's not going to be rewarded. The work isn't going to be rewarded, and it's not going to be rewarded in very different ways based on our own social locations. And just thinking about who is actually doing that work, and it's coming, you know, from the streets, it's coming from students, it's coming from targeted or marginalized faculty that are going through complaint processes. It's coming from union work, right? We have 3 unions on campus. Thanks.
So I'm being told we've run out of time, but thank you very much for all your contributions. What we do want to focus on, perhaps you've also, you know, remembered it, is that we're talking about a whole different framework for seeking justice, you know, social justice, something that's relational and something that's we know to be diametrically opposed to the way knowledge is structured around, you know, a voice that doesn't acknowledge its position, right? That's usually the neutrality and objectivity that we're used to in the academic setting, right? We're not saying it's totally useless, but we should also be mindful of how it's the language of power, and it, you know, it lacks accountability. You know, so changing the way we talk about EDI will definitely move us to better futures, hopefully. And thank you for starting this conversation with us. Angie actually has some gifts for our panelists. And we just wanted to make note that each of our panelists will be receiving the book by Susan, Braided Learning, but and we will point you to the chapter that inspired us in particular for taking this conversational approach, Braided Learning. But of course, Susan, we're not giving